In this lesson, we are going to learn about the beginning of the Civil War, which was because President Lincoln, a Republican, was elected, which gave the northern free states control of the House, the Senate, and the President, which means they could pass laws ending slavery. The election of Lincoln causes South to secede, and that secession is eventually met with military preparation, which results in fighting breaking out and the Civil War beginning. Before we get to that, though, let's review about the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Now, the Kansas-Nebraska Act replaced the Missouri Compromise. The Missouri Compromise, which let Maine in as a free state, Missouri as a slave state, and created the line in the Louisiana Territory above which no new slave states could be created, was replaced by the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The motive to replace this was because there was support needed for the Transcontinental Railroad, and the Southern support would only be attained if the South were to receive something that they wanted, which was the repeal of the Missouri Compromise. So, following the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Louisiana Territory would be able to choose whether they wanted to be slave or free through the concept of popular sovereignty. Now, what happened was people deliberately moved to Kansas to influence the vote and swing the state towards their desired outcome of slave or free. This fighting between abolitionists and pro-slavery gave Kansas the nickname Bleeding Kansas. And Bleeding Kansas, which would be a state of chaos, would result in the formation of the new political party, the Republicans, which the Republicans would become the party that we associate with anti-slavery, because it was made up largely of the anti-slavery groups. It was made up of the Liberty Party, which were abolitionists, the Free Soil Party, which opposed the expansion of slavery. This is actually what President Lincoln ran as, a free soiler, and some Northern Whigs and Democrats. Now, the lesson today is about the Republican Party, the election of Lincoln, and a few other decisions that would create sectional differences or increase sectionalism. So, the Republican Party would be made up of Northern Whigs, Northern Democrats, those opposed to the expansion of slavery, the Free Soil Party, and abolitionists who don't not only want slavery to stop expanding, but it to be outlawed in the United States as a whole, called the Liberty Party. Now, they would form into the general anti-slavery party, or the Republicans. Before we get to the election of Abraham Lincoln, we are going to talk about another event that would increase sectionalism, but it would be a temporary victory for the South in the fight against slavery. And this was known as the Dred Scott Decision. Now, the Supreme Court, which many of you have asked me questions, why didn't the Supreme Court decide the Alien Sedition Acts were unconstitutional? Well, it was largely had no power back then, but it started to get involved, and it did make a very controversial decision that would anger the North and please the South, and that was the Dred Scott decision. Now, I'm trying to draw an awful drawing of Dred Scott here, which is not my worst, but I'm not a professional. And Dred Scott was a slave, and an interesting thing happened to him that required a Supreme Court decision. And what happened is, Dred Scott's master took him to a free state, and then his master died, and Dred Scott was left in that free state. And Dred Scott said, well, I'm in a free state. I must be free. And the Supreme Court didn't know what he was, so they had to debate. And what they debated and what they ruled would please the South. So you can bet it wasn't good for Dred Scott. So Dred Scott's argument was, hey, Supreme Court, my master took me to a free state and passed away. I'm free, right? And his statement was, once free, always free. Well, he expected the Supreme Court to say, yeah, you don't have any owner, so you must be free. Except the Supreme Court, and I believe his name was Justice Roger Taney, was the Chief Justice back then, said, no, Dred Scott, you're not free. You're property. And then they went on further to pretty much say slavery cannot be limited, because by limiting slavery, it's like saying that you cannot bring your property wherever you want. So the Dred Scott decision basically ruled that slaves are property and therefore are not free, and that slave owners can take them wherever they want. So furthermore, the Missouri Compromise, popular sovereignty, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, they are all illegal and unconstitutional because they limit the right of owners to take their property wherever they want. So, furthermore, the Missouri Compromise, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, popular sovereignty, all of these restrictions on new slave states being formed from territories like the Louisiana Purchase and the Mexican Cession, they're all unconstitutional because they deny slave owners the right to take their property wherever they want. As you can imagine, this made Southerners very happy, but it would increase sectionalism because the northern free states were pretty much told that, hey, I know you're free, but slavery can expand here. All your laws against slavery were unconstitutional because they limit the right of slave owners to take their property where they want. And as those northern states pretty much figured out, according to this ruling, will all be slave states. Now, the real quick way to remember Dred Scott decision is that it pretty much said slaves are property and can be taken anywhere in the United States. So what happened to Dred Scott, I'm not sure. He had no owner, so I assume the original state he was from gained possession of him and re-auctioned him off. I need to look that up, actually. So the Dred Scott decision was an attempt by the Supreme Court to end the controversy over the role of free states in determining the status of the enslaved. Dred Scott was a slave whose master had taken him into free territory, and with the help of Northern abolitionists, Dred Scott sued his master for freedom, although his master died. Once free, always free. There's a picture of Dred Scott. As you can tell, I tried to somewhat draw him. The Dred Scott decision, though, would increase sectionalism because in the decision, the Supreme Court decided that slaves were not citizens, that slaves did not have the right to sue. Actually, that slaves had no rights at all, that Dred Scott was property, and that based on the U.S. Constitution, owner's property cannot be taken away by the government. The court further ruled that Congress could not pass measures such as the Missouri Compromise or the Kansas-Nebraska Act limiting the expansion of slavery into the territories. It ruled that such acts were unconstitutional because they denied the slave owner the right to take his property anywhere that he wanted. The Dred Scott decision did not end the controversy. In fact, it increased sectionalism. Northerners claimed that the court would deny them the right to outlaw slavery in their states and would end the idea of popular sovereignty. South Carolina applauded the decision and accepted the court's ruling as the final word on the issue. As has been said before, this, like other rulings the North and South disagreed on, would increase sectionalism. Before we get to the election of Lincoln, we're going to talk about another incident that would increase sectionalism. Here is John Brown. John Brown was fighting in Bleeding, Kansas, and he was an abolitionist. And John Brown tried to arm slaves to incite a slave rebellion in Virginia. So John Brown, whose picture we just saw, was an abolitionist. He was fighting in Bleeding, Kansas, and he raids an arsenal to get the weapons. An arsenal is where guns are kept and other things of that military weapons. Well, John Brown's raid was unsuccessful, and it increased sectionalism even more. You can see this raid was in 1859, 2 years before the Civil War. The John Brown raid on an arsenal in what's called Harper's Ferry, Virginia, this would increase sectionalism, just like the Dred Scott decision, just like every other ruling that had to do with the expansion of slavery. And this also raises fears of the South that freed slaves will be dangerous, and they probably have their expectation is probably correct, because can't blame the slaves. They've been treated quite poorly, and some are probably quite angry. So let's look a little bit more about John Brown, who wanted to arm slaves, before we get to President Lincoln's election. it would be the election of 1860, which would cause the South to secede. And then that secession of the South, of South Carolina, this would cause a response from the North. And that response would be to resupply the federal forts that are in the South. And then that would force the Southern response, which was to fire on the Northern ships, which is how the first shots of the Civil War began. And these shots were first fired in South Carolina at Fort Sumter. But the political consequence of Lincoln getting elected would be dire for the South. We know that the North controlled the House early in the 1800s. Then, with the admission of California into the state, they controlled the Senate. So, they had a majority in both the House and Senate, and all they would need would be a president to sign an anti-slavery bill, and that nightmare for the South would become a reality. Well, that scenario became more likely with the election of Abraham Lincoln. And even though ending slavery wasn't the majority opinion, the expansion of slavery had more support than ending it outright. So for this reason, Abraham Lincoln campaigned on a free soil platform, which was against the expansion of slavery, as we see over here. Now, Abraham Lincoln did not campaign as an abolitionist. Research into Lincoln will tell anyone who's curious that he hated slavery and probably truly was an abolitionist, but he did not campaign as an abolitionist. He campaigned as a free soiler. Now, Abraham Lincoln won the 1860 election with electoral votes from the North. The North unified their votes. The South could have contested better if they wouldn't have split their votes among several candidates. Now, we can see this in a few minutes on the last slide. But the important thing, more important than the fact that the South lost by splitting their votes, is that, as has been said many times before, due to the political consequences of the election of 1860, the South said, "Hey, U.S., we're seceding." And they signed the Articles of Secession, which, when you secede, is when you break away from the country. Now, of course, they're just saying, we are no longer part of the United States. So if you cross our border, you're in a different part of the United States. The North, of course, couldn't let this go, which is why war would be inevitable. South Carolina, in seceding or leaving the United States, claimed that the rights of South Carolinians had not and would not be protected by the federal government. 6 more states seceded soon after. And the North was forced into a response, which the response would be to prepare for war. The preparation would ultimately lead to war. Now, less important, but still a fact that needs covered, the South and border states split their votes among several candidates. Now, after Lincoln's election, South Carolina called a special convention, signed the Articles of Secession, claiming that the rights of South Carolinians had not been and would not be protected by the federal government. 6 other southern states seceded soon after. So, if you were to make a comparison, the election of Lincoln would be like the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand to World War I. The election of Lincoln to the Civil War would be like that culminating event. Now, you can see the Electoral College here, which is an entirely different lesson, but you can see the North unified their votes for Lincoln, which the way it works is that even if a state votes 51-49%, all 35 of those votes go to Lincoln. Where the South, they split their votes among several candidates. If you look, I introduced you to Stephen Douglas in the previous lesson. He ran, but he only won one state, Missouri. So this splitting of votes would cause the South to not compete in the election. If you see, though, the North had way more votes here. So even if they wouldn't have split their votes, would it have been a factor? I doubt this point that I'm supposed to make to you. Well, in the next lesson, we learn about the South Carolina Secession Convention and some of the different people, and that not all of South Carolina wanted to secede during the Civil War. There were some that wanted to stay part of the Union, and others thought that we should be careful about secession. We would pay dearly for our seceding first, though, because General William Tecumseh Sherman would be sent to punish the South for seceding, and the bullseye was on South Carolina, the first state to secede. Until then, thank you for listening. I hope you did well.